Good morning, everyone. So today we're talking about state. Really important concept to grasp in React. It's not exclusive to React. We use state in other applications, but we'll look specifically today of how we manage state in React. So we've already looked at ways of passing data to various React components. But then when we pass that data in, we usually just render it as it is. Yeah? The props themselves in React are meant to be immutable. Do you know what I mean by the word immutable?
You can't change it.
Yeah, you can't change it, or you shouldn't change it in this case. But technically, we can actually change the props object, but we should not, because that will affect how the internals of React are actually working, and we will mess something up, and it'd be very hard to debug if we change the props. So do not change the props object. So props and state in React are both just simply JavaScript objects. There's essentially nothing fancy about them. The only fancy thing is how React handles the props object and the state object. Okay, so state itself then. State is where we store any data that we don't want to be immutable, data that we want to change. That is what we store in the state object. And usually that changes as a result of some user interaction, right? They click something on the page and that updates a value. Whatever, lots of different things could do that. They could submit a form and we want to give some feedback on that form. All those sorts of things we can store inside of the state object. So most of you now have completed or at least looked at task 13, which is the task in your CodeFlix app that deals with state. So you might be able to offer me a few hints of what I need to do to this class component here. Oops, I'll just move that one on down in case that was giving us a clue. What do we need to do to this class component to enable us to use state within it? Yep, we definitely need a constructor. Where would that go? Typically.
Above render?
Yeah, above render. Essentially, it's the first bit of code that will run inside of a class. So therefore, it makes sense to put it up the top of our app. And the syntax for that then, is it something like that?
And in the parentheses we put a props or whatever.
I'm not going to worry about passing props in for now, but yeah, absolutely. If we did want to pass some props in, then they would go inside of there. Yeah. What's the next step? Super. Do we know why we're using super? Or do we know what it does? We haven't explained that yet. Yeah, so essentially it's letting us access the parent class, which we might need some properties or methods that are only available by default inside of that parent class. What is the parent class in this case? Yeah, can everyone see that? So we've got our class here that we're defining. We're in the process of defining and creating, but that extends, that's the keyword in JavaScript, and that extends component. So the parent class or the parent object is component in this case, which is React.component. Yeah, you might have seen it written that way instead. You might have seen it written like that, React.component, and that's fine as well, but because we've used an import component from React up here, we can just abbreviate that to component. Yes, you might see it written both ways. It's doing exactly the same thing, importing the component object from the React library. Doing that allows us to have access to methods such as setState, which is inherited from the React component. So without calling super, we wouldn't be able to have access to that setState method. So very, very important. Don't forget that one. Okay, and then how about setting some initial values for the state? How would I do that? This dot state, yeah. So in general, just think of for now, if you're inside a class-based component and you want to access some variables, most of the time you have to append it with this, yeah. So this dot state, this dot whatever variable or method that you've defined inside of your state. We'll talk about the this keyword quite a bit more later on in the course, but for now, just remember, inside of a class, I probably need a this in front of my variable names. So this dot state, okay, and then what do we do with that state?
Equals an object.
Yeah, so it will always be equal an object, as I said, in React, state is just a basic JavaScript object, so that's all we're doing here. We're creating that basic object. And then because it is an object, we need some key value pairs, right? So in this case, I've asked a question. Do we understand state in React? And the answer probably initially might be not yet, or not fully yet, okay? So we haven't covered a lot of it. You've just had a very surface level look at it so far. So instead of hard coding not yet, I instead want to set it as an initial value in my state, and then maybe when we've learned some more, we can update it to say, yes, yeah, I understand state in React. So for now, I'm just going to give it a key of answer, so it's the answer to our question down here, and the value we could put in as a string to say not yet. Notice that yet, yeah, so we're definitely going to learn it at some stage, and we're definitely going to understand it at some stage. If you don't, then you need to pick our brains, mine and Ricardo's brains, a lot more, and we will help you understand it. Okay, so I've set an initial value in the state. Great, so I've created an object, it's got a key and a value, so I'll be able to access it later if I need it. The question is, where and how do I access that value that we've stored in the state? Yeah, if we want to display it on the page, so at the moment our page just looks like that. It's just a basic question. Do we understand state in React? And we want to answer. I mean, I could even create it in its own separate paragraph, perhaps, might be useful. And inside of there, we want to display answer. And how can we access the not yet string?
Inside curly braces, we got this dot state dot answer.
Thank you, Richard. So you're the very, very vocal one in the class this morning. I'll pick on someone else soon, but yep, totally correct. So we can use curly braces just to say this is a bit of JavaScript now, and we put this dot state dot answer. Yeah, it's just how we would usually access any object properties or any object values by using dot notation, right? We covered this in week 1, and you've used it almost, well, you must have used it every day, I imagine, especially in JavaScript challenges and things like that. Okay, so we've referenced this dot state dot answer. So if we go back to our application, we see underneath not yet. You want to add an exclamation mark, perhaps? Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty good. Like, it's okay, we've set an initial value and then we've just displayed it, but we're not currently able to update it in any way. We would have to go into the source code and say, oh, yes. And then of course it would change, right? But that's no different to sending a value in as prop. We're still hard coding it. So what could we do? Oops, that's a bit forceful. Not yet. So what could we do instead that would enable us to update the state?
Could put an input field or a button or something.
Yeah, so I want to cover 2 ways, and we're definitely, what you would use in a production app would often be some sort of button or something that the user can interact with. The way that we've currently seen in your app was you just set a timeout, didn't you? Like after a certain amount of time, then update something. So yeah, you're sort of aware of how that works, but I'll cover that for other people who maybe haven't got that far. So there was a method that we could, well, it was a built-in method in React, and it runs only at certain points in the execution of your component. It runs specifically after the initial render. What was that method called? Anyone else apart from Richard? And then I'll come to Richard. Component did mount. Yeah, exactly. So at the moment, the flow of this code starts once we get inside the class. Yeah, once it reads the class, it reads the constructor, and it runs the code inside of that constructor first. Then the component will do an initial render, so it will run through this code once. When it does do that, it renders that on the page, not yet. However, if straight after the initial render, we wanted to change the state, and this will be particularly useful when you come on to making third-party API calls, so making fetch calls to external data. That can take some time. We don't want to force the user to wait for that information before we display anything on the page. So therefore, we're doing an initial render so that our page looks okay. They're aware that something's happening, nothing's gone wrong. And then we might just display a loading icon for the data that we're currently fetching, or they might even have a button, get more information. And only then do we execute this operation that takes some time. Yeah. So that's a typical use case of using component did mount. That's where you set your timeout, right? After 3 seconds, then it did something. So what method do we use to update the state? We've inherited it from that React component. Anyone? So set timeout's not going to actually update the state for us on its own. Yeah, set timeout is just a general method in JavaScript that we can use to delay the execution of code. But what did you put inside that set timeout in your project?
Set state?
Yeah, it's called set state, wasn't it? So that's a specific method that's built into React, specifically the React component. Oops, not set React, just because I said the word React at the time. Set state. And is it just set state? Or okay, it's already amended it for me. So it's this.set state, yeah? And then what do we pass to, well, okay, we have to invoke it first. And then what do we pass to this.set state? What argument does it take?
The key of the object.
So it takes an object, yeah? And the key value needs to be,
In this case, answer.
yeah, in this case we want to update the answer. So our key is answer again. And instead of not yet, you could say, do you want to say yes yet or get in there? What do you want to say? Getting closer, yeah? Hell yeah, says Vince. We'll say getting closer for now, and then we'll maybe change it to hell yeah in a second, right? Okay, so in the component did mount, then we can update the state. And that's one way of doing it. So this should update almost immediately. Probably too quick for our human eyes even to detect. But what the code has done is it's run through the constructor first, then it's done an initial render. This was clearly visible when you did your set timeout. And then component did mount will run straight afterwards. Yeah, so it's not following the top to bottom order. Component did mount only runs after the initial render, and it only runs once. So if I went to my app, it says getting closer, and if anyone's got really good eyes, they might see a difference here, but I doubt it. It just looks like it initially says getting closer, right? Which is why we made you set a timeout first so that you could clearly see the difference. Okay. Yeah, another way that we might update. Sorry, any questions on that before we move on? Just the flow of the application and yeah.
So basically, component now changes the initial objects. Is that right?
Component did mount itself isn't doing that. Component did mount is just a method or a function, if you like, that gets called automatically by the React.
So will it replace not yet?
Will it replace what? Sorry.
Not yet value.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what it's doing. So initially we had the not yet value stored in the state, but because we use the set state method, that's the key method that's changing our state, then our state got updated. And yeah, set state is important because that forces a re-render. It forces the render method to run again. So you might have thought, well, state is an object. Oh, how do we usually update an object? Well, we could just do this dot state to access it, and we could do this dot state dot answer equals, what was it? Hell yeah, Vince, wasn't it? Yeah, I'll give it the string. Yeah. So you might have thought, oh, I could do that. Please don't do that in React, yeah? Because it's going to be a little bit unpredictable doing it that way to determine when your render method will run again. So React's got its built-in diffing algorithm, yeah? Has something changed in my application? Oh, if it has, then update the view, but it tries to batch those updates so it's not constantly re-rendering your application. So this won't force the re-render. This will just say, okay, I've changed the state. When you do happen to do another render again, make sure you use this value, right? So it won't necessarily be an immediate update. So don't update your state in that way. It will work eventually, but the interface will be, the display on the page will be unpredictable for the end user, yeah? Say again? This will probably work now because we've only got one component and it's very simple, right? But I can run it, yeah. So in fact, it didn't actually update, right? So the new value of the state is there, but it hasn't re-rendered yet. Yeah, so that's actually a really good example. I thought it would actually update, but no. So therefore, it hasn't updated. But if we console.log, and we could say the val of answer inside, this stands for component did mount, right? Is and then we're going to do this dot state dot answer, right? This dot state dot answer. Yep. And if I inspect that, where is it? That one. And we refresh that page. Hopefully we're going to get a console log. I've got a warning. Yeah. But you see the value of answer inside our component did mount is actually hell yeah, but that's not being reflected on the page yet. And look what warning we got. Do not mutate state directly. Use set state. Yeah, so it's clearly advising you that if you want a predictable render, and you want to force your app to re-render when you change something,
Oh, so it doesn't allow it.
well, it's not a case of it's let you change it because we clearly see that the variable's changed, but that render method hasn't run again to update the display of our web page.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the key difference. So even though it's an object, please don't do that. Make sure you use. Have you got a question, Richard?
You said that the set state is also an asynchronous function.
Yeah. Set state is an asynchronous function call. Absolutely. Yep. So we'll come on to that later, where you might actually use this .set state and it still doesn't update exactly how you intended. But there are numerous ways around that by either passing passing this .set state as a function, as a callback, and things like that. But we'll talk about asynchronous code quite a bit later in the course. But you're quite right. This set state is an asynchronous method. Yeah. So if I had something, even if I did that, what do you think the value of this .state, the answer is going to be now? Inside of, well, by the time line 16 runs, will it still be not yet, or will it have changed to getting closer?
Could very well be not yet.
Could very well be not yet, because we just said set state is asynchronous. So in other words, when we encounter an asynchronous method, that gets put aside for a later time. And then when the stack is clear, then it gets run. When there's no more code to execute inside of that function, then it will get run. So I believe, unless React is doing something under the hood that I'm not aware of, then this .state.answer should now be not yet when we run it. So ignore the first console because that's from the previous time. Of course, getting closer is now displayed because we correctly updated the state using this .set state. Now if I refresh the page, what's our value going to be? Not yet, you see? So in this case, line 16 has run before line 14 gets executed because set state is asynchronous. If you don't fully understand this at the moment, I totally understand. This is more advanced stuff, yeah, asynchronous JavaScript, very, very useful stuff, and we will cover it a lot towards the middle to the end of the course. Okay, for now, let's concentrate on state. How do we update it? Well, we set it using this .state in the constructor, and we update it using this .set state somewhere else in our code, yeah, inside of some method or user-defined function. All right. So I want to look at one other example. Just bear with me while I copy the code across. Oh, did I pull something away there? I think I've just dragged my code in weird ways. Let me highlight the whole thing. And we are going to replace, what did I have in there? Yeah, we're going to replace the whole of this class with a counter. So now if I go back to my web page and zoom out a little bit, not on that screen, then we should have just a basic counter set up like this. You can't see very well on the screen in the room, but these are a slightly different color. So the increase count and the decrease count are buttons that the user can click on, and when they do, the number gets updated. So in other words, now we've got some sort of user interaction. It's not just happening at a certain point in time. It's dependent on the user telling the state to update. So this is what Richard was hinting at earlier, yeah? So if we go back to the code. So here's just the paragraph displaying my initial count, which I've initialized to 0 up there, yeah? And then coming down, just give us a bit more room. coming down, we can see now that we've got some buttons, and we've used onClick. So again, we're going to cover this next week, but just to give you a taster, this is how you would write some events and their subsequent event handlers in React. There's quite a few ways to do this actually, but this way that I'm doing here, I believe it's called the property initializer syntax here. So yeah, what we're doing is we define an event. So what sort of event is it? Well, this is a click event. And events are things that are monitored in the browser. So you could look up MDM events or browser events, and click is one of those built into the browser, such as mouse up, mouse down, all these sorts of things, right? Tons and tons of events. On blur, on focus, which we're using on the platform that Porek knows all about. And getting his focus score deducted. So they're all events, right? And in this case, it's just a simple click event. Then what do we do when that click event happens? Well, we run this bit of code, this.incrementCount, which is a method that we've defined within our class. So in other words, when the user clicks on the increase count button, then the increment count method runs. And notice that it's very similar, right? All we're doing is passing a function which calls this.setState. Yeah, I didn't actually want to confuse you and use previous state, but never mind. I should have changed that before the workshop, apologies. But all it's doing is then incrementing the state based on the previous state. Could we do this a different way? Let's try and do it, yeah? So we're used to saying count, this.setState, pass it an object, and then what do I want my count to be?
This.state.count plus 1.
Yeah, so we're going to reference the initial count, which we could have also done using that. This.state.count plus 1, yeah? If we're incrementing by 1. And I think we're meant to have spaces, aren't we? And then we can do something very, very similar for the decrement count. Will this still work as intended? Let's have a look. It will. Yeah. So that's in a syntax that we're very familiar with based on the previous example, yeah? Any questions on that? Because there's a bit more going on, but it just shows you how, again, that when we change the state, that change can automatically get reflected on the page if we use the this.setState method. Yeah, it's in real time. The user feels like they're changing something immediately. Yeah. Any questions?
In the documentation, they're saying that using component did mount can cause some performance issues. Is that
Where have you found that? The documentation is very good, by the way. I do recommend that you read it on reactjs.org.
Yeah, that's fine.
Whereabouts did you find that? Is it in state and lifecycle or component?
React.component, and there's a paragraph about component did mount.
So you're on a different article. You're on a component
Yeah.
thing. Can cause performance issues. Yeah, I'm not fully sure what they mean by that.
Yeah,
So-
it says using this pattern use this pattern with caution because it often causes performance issues.
Component. I can't find it. I might have to have a look later. Sorry.
But does it just mean that it might just slow down the browser a bit? Because obviously, if you're dating the state object, then obviously you will have a moment of transition. Is that just what they actually mean?
I don't know. I'd have to read the article and see in what context they've used it and everything to understand what they meant by that. But in component did mount anyway, we only usually put things that take a long time because they're things that we don't want to initially render. So therefore we put them in component did mount just so that they collect that data when time isn't as critical. You know, we can give them a little bit extra time to do that. We've kept the user happy by displaying something and giving them something to read while we go and make that network call or something. So yeah, I'd have to read the article to see exactly what they meant, but yeah, I think it's still valid at this stage to use component did mount in certain cases, such as making fetch calls to third-party APIs. It makes sense to me. You just want to get that data once when the component is initially loaded. Yeah, I wouldn't use it all the time, or I wouldn't set your initial state or anything inside of there, of course, but yeah, for updating in certain cases, I think it's definitely valid. But anyway, I mean, usually in most applications, it's going to be something similar to what we were doing with this one anyway. There's some user interaction that triggers it. So when we're doing that, we're not using component did mount at all. Yeah, you see, we're just using our own custom defined methods. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's just how you write a function in a class. So there is really no other way to do it other than that. And we're not using component did mount or any other lifecycle methods at all. We're just using our own custom defined methods. Yeah. So that will be the more common use case. But I would still argue that it's okay to use component did mount when we make fetch calls. Or fetch external data that takes a long time anyway. Yeah. Any other questions? No, I thought you had loads stored up for me, Nalofa. Does that mean I've covered some things, or? Yeah, I covered a few things. Okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah, so just get used to this syntax. You know, make sure you define your initial state inside of your constructor. And then how do you render it using this dot state dot, whatever the name of the variable is. And then look at how you can either write your own custom methods to update the state. Of course, you're going to use this dot set state inside of there rather than doing it like you would update a normal object in JavaScript. And then later on, I don't want to talk about today just because we're running out of time and it's a whole separate topic really, is we'll look at React hooks as well and how we can use that to update state and use effects and things like that. But yeah, that needs at least 20 minutes to half an hour on its own, right? So we'll have a go in the future at rewriting a class-based component using React hooks, and we can still use state. If you're interested in the meantime, if you want to start experimenting with that in your code, then there was a very good workshop by one of our students last bootcamp who talked about React hooks. So Gower, I think if we searched on YouTube, we could probably find that. Yeah, I'll send the link later. If not, I will leave it there. Cool. Thank you very much.